All right, I already know. This is long. You don't have the attention span for it, but don't panic. I'm breaking it up into a bunch of videos because this is very long. So, your answers are coming. What this is about? Well, here is the title, let's say. Republicans break it, Democrats fix it, and I've got the receipts. So let's start. A historic pattern. Republicans crash, Democrats rescue. This boom and bust cycle of Republican wreckage followed by Democratic repairs isn't new. In fact, it goes back to at least the Great Depression. Republican President Herbert Hoover left office in 1933 with the Bacon system near collapse, unemployment at about 25%. Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt swooped in with the New Deal, stabilizing banks and putting Americans back to work, effectively cleaning up Hoover's economic catastrophe. Ever since, it seems every time the GOP steers the economy into a ditch, a Democrat has to pull it out. Nowhere is this pattern clearer than from the Reagan era to today, where the evidence is both factual and, frankly, darkly comic. Okay, this is part 2 of how Republicans destroy, Democrats repair the Reagan Revolution. It's trickle down and debt up. So, Ronald Reagan rode into the White House in 1981, preaching the gospel of small government and supply side economics. In practice, that meant massive tax cuts for the wealthy and a defense spending binge, all based on the magical belief that prosperity would trickle down to everyone else. Spoiler alert, it didn't exactly trickle. What did flow freely was red ink. Reagan added over $1.6 trillion to the national debt and even doubled the federal budget deficit, which hit record highs above $200 billion on his watch. So much for fiscal conservatism. While he slashed social programs, he hiked military spending by 35% in his 2 terms. Because nothing says small government like building bonds with borrowed money. By the time Reagan left office in 1989, the U.S. was deep in debt, and income inequality had begun its ominous rise. Republicans held it as an economic triumph. Mountains of debt and growing wealth gap told a different story, one Democrats would later have to address. All right, this is the 3rd video in our understanding of Republicans destroy and Democrats come in to save. Now, I'm going to do multiple versions of this, smaller ones, different things for TikTok, YouTube, but this is the long sort of essay that I wrote about all of this. So you're getting the full thing with these videos. This is only the 3rd. It's going to take quite a few, so buckle in. So let's start now with Bush Sr. Promises, and a recession. Reagan's VP, George H.W. Bush, inherited the mess in 1989, and families had to break his no new taxes pledge to rein in the deficits. Cue the fury of his own party. Despite the dose of reality, Bush Sr. still oversaw a record deficit, about $290 billion by 1992, and an economy that lurched into recession in the early 90s. By the end of his single term, the country was sputtering with high unemployment and swelling deficit. In essence, we had 12 years of Reaganomics, 81 through 92, that left big budget holes and a mild economic hangover for the next guy to fix. And fix it, he did. All right, this is part 4. This is called Bill Clinton, cleaning up and cashing in. Enter Bill Clinton, the Democrat with a mop and toolbox. Taking office in 1993, Clinton faced 10 million unemployed, record deficits, and stagnant growth. His response? A mix of budget discipline, including tax increases on the rich, which Republicans swore would destroy the economy, and investments in people. The 1990s saw the longest economic expansion in U.S. history up to that point, with growth averaging 4% a year, far higher than the 2.8% average during the Reagan-Bush years. By the end of Clinton's 2 terms, 22.5 million new jobs have been created. Yes, that's more jobs in 8 years than the preceding 12 years of Reagan-Bush. Clinton didn't just clean up the Reagan-Bush fiscal mess, he polished the floor. The budget deficit that peaked near $300 billion in the early 90s turned into a budget surplus by the end of the decade. In 2000, the U.S. ran a $237 billion surplus, the largest ever. Federal debt held by the public, which had quadrupled under Reagan-Bush, actually began to shrink under Clinton. The government paid down $363 billion of debt between 1998 and 2000. Fiscal responsibility much? Clinton even had the U.S. on track to pay off the entire national debt by 2012. One can imagine the Republican horror at this development. After all, how do you run on fiscal conservatism when that guy from Arkansas balanced the budget and you didn't? GOP, lacking other issues, trained their sights on scandal and social wedge issues. More on that later. Much more on that later. The economic facts are clear. Clinton inherited a mess and left an economic masterpiece. Low unemployment, low inflation, rising incomes, and yes, a balanced budget. All right, this is part 5, I believe. Works to be Bush, from surplus to super mess. So, what did the next Republican president do with this shiny golden economy? George W. Bush took office in 2001 with a budget surplus and a robust economy, and he proceeded to squander it with remarkable speed. Bush pushed through massive tax cuts, 2001 and 2003, skewed heavily towards the wealthy, of course, arguing that the surplus proved Americans were overtaxed. The result? By 2002, the surplus was gone, and by 2004, the budget was back in the red by hundreds of billions. Bush also launched 2 expensive wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, while enacting a new unfunded entitlement, Medicare prescription drug benefit. The GOP's credit card got quite a workout. By 2008, as Bush's presidency neared its end, the annual deficit had exploded to $458 billion, a new record at the time. So, in one 2-term swoop, Bush 43 went from Clinton's $236 billion surplus to nearly a $500 billion deficit. Fiscal conservatism, who? But the budget deficit was only part of the carnage. Bush's watch included the complete meltdown of the economy in the Great Recession of 2008. Under his laissez-faire regulatory stance, Wall Street had a wild party with subprime mortgages and complex derivatives, and the party ended in a nationwide hangover. By late 2008, the U.S. economy was in free fall. The housing market collapsed. Major financial institutions were failing, and hundreds of thousands of Americans were losing jobs every month. In Bush's final year alone, 2008, about 2.6 million jobs disappeared. In fact, from 2001 to 2008, the U.S. added a net of only 2.1 million jobs total, essentially an anemic trickle of job growth over 8 years. As one analyst dryly noted, the economy created nearly 5.5 times more jobs under Obama's 2 terms than under Bush's, 11.3 million versus 2.1. More on Obama in a second, but the point is, Bush handed his successor an economy in ruins. The budget deficit for fiscal year 2009, which began before Obama took office, blew up to $1.4 trillion as the government desperately tried to stop the bleeding. The country was hemorrhaging jobs. About 800,000 jobs were lost in January 2009 alone as Bush left office. It was the worst economic crisis since Hoover's Great Depression. Once again, a Democrat would have to play the role of national janitor. Part 6, Barack Obama, Janitor-in-Chief of the Great Recession. When Barack Obama took the oath in January 2009, the U.S. economy was literally collapsing. Faced with the specter of another depression, Obama moved fast. Despite GOP opposition at every turn, he signed a roughly $800 billion stimulus, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, rescued the auto industry, and worked with the Fed to stabilize the financial system. It worked. The economy stopped contracting and began growing again by late 2009. And by early 2010, the hemorrhaging of jobs had turned into growth. America saw uninterrupted job growth for every single month for the rest of Obama's tenure. The longest streak of continuous job gains on record, 75 straight months. The unemployment rate, which peaked at 10% in 2009, steadily fell to 4.7%. By Obama's final month, again, far more than his Republican predecessor. Remember that $1.4 trillion deficit he inherited? By 2013, the annual deficit was falling fast, and by the time Obama left office in 2017, the deficit was down to about 440 billion, a reduction of roughly two-thirds. In fact, Obama cut the deficit faster than any president since World War II, albeit from a high starting point. Government budget shortfall shrank from 9.8% of GDP in fiscal year 2009 to 3.2% of GDP in 2016. Not that Republicans gave him any credit for this. They were too busy obstructing and complaining. Ironically, these are the same Republicans who had run up the bills with Bush's tax cuts and bailouts before Obama took over. By the end of Obama's term, the economy was in far better shape than he found it. Steady growth, 15 plus million private sector jobs gained since the bottom, rising incomes, a record high stock market, and a much lower deficit. In short, another Democratic president cleaned up another GOP economic debacle. Obama handed off a growing economy to the next guy, who promptly took credit for it and then set about screwing it up again. Part 7, Donald Trump, Tax Cut, Culture Wars, and Crash. Donald J. Trump, businessman, populist, self-proclaimed economic savior. Trump inherited a stable, growing economy in 2017. Monthly job growth continued right through his inauguration. Initially, things stayed on course. Unemployment kept ticking down and the stock market ticked up, largely following the trajectory already set. But Trump's signature economic move was the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a gigantic package of tax cuts, mostly for corporations and the wealthy. Of course, again. Republicans promised it would pay for itself and supercharge growth. Instead, it ballooned the deficit and led only to a brief sugar high for the economy. By 2019, before COVID, annual deficits neared $1 trillion again under Trump. Yes, in the middle of a strong economy with low unemployment, Trump is running almost $1 trillion deficit. A pretty neat trick considering Republicans love to claim they are fiscally responsible. In fact, 2019's $984 billion deficit was nearly double the deficit Obama left in 2016. So much winning. Trump also loved to crow about the stock market and jobs, which were indeed solid until 2020. But let's be real. Job growth in Trump's first 3 years actually slightly trailed Obama's last 3 years in average monthly gains. And then, of course, came the crash. The COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, and the Trump administration's chaotic response, from denial and misinformation to delayed action, didn't help. The economy went off the cliff. In the span of 2 months in spring 2020, over 20 million American jobs vanished, and unemployment skyrocketed to 14.7%, the highest since the 1930s. GDP for 2020 shrank by 3.5%, the worst year for the U.S. economy since 1946. Let that sink in. Under Trump, America experienced its sharpest economic contraction in 75 years. Of course, Trump didn't single-handedly cause the pandemic downturn, but his mismanagement made a bad situation worse. By the end of Trump's term, the country was in turmoil, a pandemic raging, an economy in partial lockdown, millions still out of work, and businesses shuttered. And the man who had once boasted, "I alone can fix it," was leaving office with an even larger deficit. Fiscal year 2020's exploded to 3.1 trillion with emergency spending. Naturally, having spent freely on tax cuts and COVID stimulus, Republicans suddenly rediscovered the evil of deficits the minute a Democrat was about to take charge. Part 8. Joe Biden, yet again, a Democrat to the rescue. In January 2021, Joe Biden became the fourth consecutive Democrat president elected after a GOP president left an economic mess. Biden faced the monumental task of ending the pandemic and rescuing an economy in crisis. He moved quickly to pass the American Rescue Plan, $1.9 trillion, which every Republican in Congress opposed, of course, to get vaccines in arms, money in people's pockets, and the economy off life support. The result, a remarkably rapid jobs rebound. In Biden's first year alone, the U.S. added over 6 million jobs, a record number. And by the second year, another 4 million plus jobs. together, marking the fastest job growth for any president's first 2 years in history. As of his third year, 14.6 million net new jobs have been created under Biden, the largest increase in the first 3 years of any presidency on record. The unemployment rate plunged from 6.3% at inauguration to around 3.5%, near a 50-year low. In other words, Biden dug the country out of the deep hole that Trump left, and he did it in record time. On the fiscal front, despite Republican claims that Democrats are big spenders, Biden actually presided over a sharp deficit reduction after the emergency COVID spending. The federal budget deficit was cut in half in his first year, from $2.8 trillion in fiscal year 2021 to $1.4 trillion in fiscal year 2022. As pandemic programs expired and revenues rebounded with the economic recovery, of course, GOP politicians gave him zero credit for this. Instead, they returned to their usual playbook, fear-mongering and finger-pointing, suddenly pretending to care about the debt again after cheerleading trillions in red ink under Trump. By 2023, inflation, a global problem after COVID, became the new Republican talking point. But notably, the U.S. economy avoided the recession many predicted, and inflation began easing. All told, Biden once again demonstrated the pattern: fix the economic damage of the previous Republican and get things back on track. You're welcome, America. Part 9. All right, we move on from the presidents as we went through each of them. Now, the next part is fear and loathing, the GOP distractions playbook. By now, you might wonder, given this track record, how on earth do Republicans keep getting elected? How do they persuade voters to put them back in charge after repeatedly tanking the economy? The answer? They distract, deflect, and scare the heck out of people. When you don't have a good economic record to run on, you turn to social issues, stoke cultural wars, and exploit racial fears. It's a tried and true GOP strategy for decades. Basically, trick the most vulnerable or angry voters into blaming others for their problems instead of the guys actually holding the levers of power. Let's review some of the greatest hits of this playbook. We'll start with the Southern strategy from 1960s onwards. After Democrats passed civil rights legislation, the GOP openly disaffected white voters in the South by exploiting racial resentment. GOP strategist Lee Atwater later admitted how Republicans switched from using the N-word in the 1950s to using abstract issues like states' rights and cutting taxes, knowing that the byproduct of these policies is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. In other words, they use coded racism to appeal to racist sentiments without overt slurs. Race baiting went from explicit to implicit, but it was still the central strategy to win over angry white voters. Ever since Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, Republican politicians have not been shy about stoking racial fears, opposing busing for school integration, demonizing affirmative action, and pushing tough on crime rhetoric that portrays urban, read black, population as dangerous. Next will come the Reagan welfare queen, Willie Horton ad, both gay marriage and immigration, a lot of issues that the GOP has used to get elected because they fail on economics. Reagan's welfare queen, 76 to 80, basically. Ronald Reagan perfected the art of the racially coded dog whistle on the campaign trail. He loved to tell the story of a so-called welfare queen in Chicago, a real woman who defrauded welfare, who Reagan hyperbolically exaggerated into a caricature of a black woman living high on taxpayer money. He claimed that she had 80 names, 30 addresses, and collected $150,000 a year in benefits and drove a Cadillac. This was mostly false. Their real figure was far less, but the narrative sure was useful. It painted an image of a black welfare recipient as lazy, greedy, and fraudsters, a symbolically terrifying stereotype that Reagan rode straight into the White House. The welfare queen myth convinced many voters that welfare, and by extension, liberal government programs, were just coddling cheats, whipping up resentment among working-class white. Reagan got to slash social safety nets under the guise of stopping these imaginary scammers. In reality, of course, most welfare recipients were nothing like Reagan's stereotype. But the racist trope had done its job. Next was the Willie Horton ad, 1988. If you want a single image of GOP fear-mongering, it's the infamous Willie Horton ad. In the 1988 campaign, George H.W. Bush's supporters ran an ad about Willie Horton, a black prisoner who committed a violent crime while on furlough in Massachusetts when Bush's opponent, Mike Dukakis, was governor. Bush's team plastered Horton's mugshot everywhere, using it to imply Dukakis was soft on crime and by extension to stoke fear of black criminals. It was a blatant attempt to trigger racial anxiety among white voters, basically saying, elect a Democrat and scary black men will come for you. One historian noted the ad used the racial facts of the case intentionally, though subtly, as part of overall strategy to recruit white voters without drawing the racist label. Subtle or not, the racial dog whistle was loud and clear. The Horton ad is credited with helping Bush win and with inaugurating a new era of gutter-level racial politics. It showed Republicans that scaring voters can work even better than inspiring them. Gay marriage ban and family values as we continue this video journey of how Republicans had destroyed the economy, Democrats come to save. We're now to the part of how on earth they keep getting elected with their track record. Next, gay marriage and family values. Not every boogeyman is racial. Sometimes it's about religion or sexuality. In 2004, with the Iraq War going south and job growth mediocre, Bush's campaign, guided by Karl Rove, leaned into family values and the threat of gay marriage to juice conservative turnout. Rove and company helped place anti-gay marriage amendments on the state ballots to turn out conservatives in key states. The message to right-wing voters was essentially, forget the deficit or the war. The real danger is gay people wanting to marry. This cynical tactic may have given Bush a boost in securing re-election by appealing to fear and prejudice. Remember the bathroom bills and other nonsense. Of course, as public opinion shifted, particular wedge issue lost potency, but it served its short-term purpose of distracting voters from costly wars and an iffy economy. Next is immigrants, which started in the 2000s and is still going today. When in doubt, blame immigrants. It's an old trick. California Governor Pete Wilson did it in the 1990s, for example. But Donald Trump weaponized it with a bullhorn. He literally launched his 2016 campaign with a speech calling Mexican immigrants rapists and criminals. They are bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people, Trump proclaimed. Subtlety was not on the menu. Trump made fear immigrants, whether it's Mexicans, Central American asylum seekers, or Muslim refugees, the centerpiece of his politics. Build the wall became a rally chant. Never mind that Mexico was never going to pay for it. The irony is rich. A billionaire demigod blaming struggling migrants for America's problems and tens of millions buying it. But it works on a visceral level. As one report noted, nothing revs up the MAGA base like immigrant bashing, and Trump even admitted that when his rally crowd got bored. I just say we will build the wall, and they go nuts. The GOP under Trump also leaned hard into nativist rhetoric about caravans and immigrants invading the country, a manufactured crisis to get votes. It's the same old play, scare people with the specter of dark-skinned foreigners and portray Democrats as the enablers of chaos. This distracts from, say, the lack of GOP healthcare plan or the latest tax giveaway to the rich. In short, when Republicans can't deliver policies that help average people, they deliver scapegoats. Immigrants, racial minorities, LGBTQ folks, woke school teachers, pick your target of the week. As long as they can get a segment of Americans feeling threatened or outraged at someone, they hope voters won't notice the party's intellectual bankruptcy on actual governance. It's cynical, but sadly effective. Ever since the 1960s, the GOP has mastered the art of culture war. They'll talk about flag burning, kneeling NFL players, Dr. Seuss, Mr. Potato Head, anything to avoid talking about how their trickle-down economics ideas keep failing ordinary Americans. And when Democrats come in and straighten things out, Republicans pivot to screaming about socialism or stoking a new moral panic. In short, when Republicans can't deliver policies that help average people, they deliver scapegoats. Immigrants, racial minorities, LGBTQ folks, woke school teachers, pick your target of the week. As long as they can get a segment of Americans feeling threatened or outraged at someone, they hope voters won't notice the party's intellectual bankruptcy on actual governance. It's cynical, but sadly effective. Ever since the 1960s, the GOP has mastered the art of culture war. They'll talk about flag burning, kneeling NFL players, Dr. Seuss, Mr. Potato Head, anything to avoid talking about how their trickle-down economics ideas keep failing ordinary Americans. And when Democrats come in and straighten things out, Republicans pivot to screaming about socialism or stoking a new moral panic.